Welcome back to another camera review. I thought I'd take a look at Canon this time. I haven't been looking at any of their products for a while. This model is the 450D or Rebel XSi. Reason I wanted to take a look at this one is it's one of the most popular ones in that particular series, which started off with the 300D. Canon had time to do quite a few improvements over the years, and it's pretty affordable too. You can get a decent one of these for around about 100 or just under. Typical for Canon, they do have the power switch with the mode dial, and this model also came with an ISO button near the shutter release. That's quite a new addition. The previous model didn't have that. On the back we have the eye sensors. That's quite useful because it will turn off the LCD display. Typical for Canon, they have most of their controls on the right hand side. You can see they're clustered around that directional pad. We'll look at some of the operation a bit later on, but it's pretty intuitive in most respects. You can see the shortcut markings on each of the buttons. And we have a reasonably decent LCD. It's quite good in terms of contrast and brightness, and the viewing angles are not bad at all. We'll move on to the other controls now. There's your depth of field preview button, and there's the button for the flash. Reasonably powerful unit, which is guide number 13. That's above average, and it does extend quite some distance up, so you're less likely to get any red eye. You can also adjust the controls so you can set the flash exposure compensation to the set button. Left hand side there are the ports, so we have the video, wired remote and the USB mini. Video out is just for a connection to a TV. We don't have video on this camera. It's a relatively small grip on this camera. I'll talk a bit about that later on. And just onto the underside, we do have the battery compartment. This battery was a slight improvement over the previous one. We have a bit more capacity. You can easily get quite a few more than the 500 that they quote. That's because the official test is with the flash every other exposure. So if you're not using flash, you'll get quite a lot of exposures out of this. Do bear in mind with the memory card, and it takes SD cards, you can only use them up to 32 gigabytes. There is a vertical grip available for this camera if you see one of these around, or third-party equivalents. You can also power it from AA batteries as well if you get the tray insert for that. I'll move on to the controls for a quick look. We have a selection of 4 metering patterns with this camera. They did add the spot metering. Click over to the right and you can see we go into the autofocus mode. Servo is Canon's word for continuous focus. Left side, click that and we get on to the drive mode. Click down and you get onto the picture styles. You can of course adjust the parameters for those if you want. The rest of the controls are pretty logical. The AV is your exposure compensation. You have your white balance there too. The blue markings are for use in playback, so that will give you different functions. For example, at the top you can zoom in with the 2 buttons. ISO button used to be on the back, but as I said earlier, it's now on the top. Only drawback with this design is because you don't have the D-pad dedicated to the focus point, you have to push in the button on the top right hand side and rotate the control dial around, which is next to the shutter release. Quickly skip through the menus now. It's typical Canon and they are quite logical in most respects, fairly easy to navigate. Most of the settings are organised quite well and you can clearly see what you're adjusting. The last icon at the right hand side is the My menu, so you can put specific items in there if you want to. Custom functions, you'll be able to see if you've changed any of the settings, it will show up as blue. The number indicates which of the settings you have changed. Only complaint I have about this is there's a few things in there which I wouldn't have put into the custom menu, such as the auto lighting optimizer. And if you want to get to the mirror lockup, you have to keep diving in there. It could have been in a better position in my opinion. You will have to go into this menu as well to activate the live view. That is off by default. You can change the color of the screen display on the back if you want to. You have a couple of different options there from darker and lighter colors. Perfectly okay screen on the camera, certainly good enough for checking focus and your exposure. You do have the choice between an RGB and luminance histogram. Another difference with this model compared to the 400D was the addition of the live view. Press the set button to activate that, and I'm showing you the contrast based live view. And to be honest, because it's one of the earlier cameras with live view, it's pretty slow. The initial focus isn't too bad, but it then seems to sort of hunt around for quite a bit to actually lock focus. So to be honest, it's really only going to be any use to you if you're doing things like still life, possibly macro or landscape photography. You can cycle through a few different settings for the display, and you can also bring up the histogram. You can use it for manual focus by zooming in if you want to, that does help. The quick mode drops the mirror down for the focus and then lifts it back up again, and it is much quicker. But you are limited to just those 9 focus points, and that's the only problem with that mode. We'll move on to the optical viewfinder now. This has a pretty decent one. They made it quite a bit larger than the 400D. We get a view which is about the same size as the Sony A100 that I looked at recently. They also added the ISO full-time view into the viewfinder with this model. We'll take a listen to the shutter sound now. Not a huge buffer on this camera for RAW, you've only got about 6 shots. If you're willing to shoot JPEG, you can get quite a few shots out of that. We'll have a look at the sensor performance now, quick test on that. We're using RAW with no noise reduction and very slight noise at ISO 400. It does go up a bit at 800, but it's still very much under control. It's still very decent at ISO 1600, the noise pattern's very easy to work with. I'm surprised Canon stopped it at 1600. I would have thought 3200 or even 6400 would be possible on this camera. The effects of the ALO or auto lighting optimizer are quite subtle at times, but it does seem to boost up the shadows a bit. Doesn't seem to do anything for the highlights though. You can get a decent latitude out of this sensor, particularly if you're underexposing. A couple of stops maybe you can pull out of it, perhaps a bit more. You won't get the extreme pushes that you get on later sensors, but it's certainly usable. This is one of the earlier cameras with the highlight tone priority, and I'll just show you the results of that. There's potential to get maybe around about a stop extra out of the highlight range. You can see that the highlight recovery is better in both the JPEGs and the RAW compared to when it's off. There are some limitations. You can't use ISO 100 when you have that on. And with the auto lighting optimizer, that doesn't work with RAW, it's just for JPEGs. Another useful feature that they have is the automatic depth of field, that's quite handy. I wanted to talk briefly about the metering, particularly with the multi-segment or evaluative metering. One of the problems I've noted with this metering pattern on this camera is it does tend to overexpose, certainly compared to other cameras that I've used, and it does it more often and to a larger degree than I would have expected. It's not a huge problem as such. You can just adjust the exposure with the compensation or possibly try something like center weighted metering. It's common for these cameras to bias some of the exposure onto the focus point, but with this model from Canon it just seems to be almost like a spot meter at times. Some people complained about the 400D underexposing, so they seem to have adjusted it perhaps a bit too much the other direction. I did test it against my Dynax 5D, and again I found there was quite a significant difference in terms of the exposure. But then I took some other shots outside and the metering seemed to be fine. It just seems to have issues at times with certain subjects in brighter light particularly. You can get some nice images out of the Canon though. It does have a pretty nice tonal reproduction. In daylight there was no obvious issues with the white balance. It was doing a pretty good job. Some people do like the Canon look. It does tend to have a different look to some of the other makers out there. And of course, once you get into the RAW processing, any of these differences become much smaller in my opinion. It's really down to the processing that you're using. Whilst 12 megapixels doesn't sound that much, it is a pretty respectable resolution. We'll just take a quick look at some of the potential issues you might find with this camera. First is the well-known error 99, which is a general error. If you do have a problem with that, the first thing I would suggest is that you clean the contacts off of the lens. And in the camera, you can use something like a pencil eraser tip, just to make sure that it's connecting properly. If it doesn't work, it could be an issue with the shutter mechanism. There's a sort of soft touch coating on the left-hand side of the camera that tends to come off. It's a pretty small point, but I thought I would mention it. The main complaint I have in terms of the camera overall is the fact that the grip isn't really that comfortable to me. I just find it a bit too shallow and it isn't that wide. Compared to some of the other cameras that I've tried, this one would rank quite low down in terms of the grip overall. Wanted to talk briefly about the differences between the 400D and the 450D because there are some quite significant ones. It's not much to do with the sensor, that's only a small increase in resolution, you wouldn't really notice that. But you have a larger viewfinder, you have the SD card, which probably is more convenient than the compact flash from the previous model. In my opinion, it makes much more sense to go for the 450D over the 400D. What do I think of the 450D overall?
Yeah, it's not bad.
There's a few negatives which I have mentioned previously, but really looking at the price that you're paying on the used market, I think this is a very decent option. It's a shame it doesn't go a bit higher with the ISO for low light photography. Have mentioned some of the negatives as well. It's obviously important to balance out the review. But if you do have any questions, do drop a comment down below and I've no problems getting back to you.